When I was 23, I married a man who was almost twice my age. And it wasn't about love, not about fate, like in the novels. I did it for the money, for the beautiful life, for the chance to break free from that gray, confined reality I was living in. I grew up in a small English town near Brighton. That place always felt like a cage to me. Identical streets, identical conversations, identical dreams. Everyone followed the same script: school, job, marriage, mortgage, vacation once a year, and on like that until retirement. No one thought bigger. Even when my classmates talked about the future, their wildest dreams were a cozy little house with a garden and a trip to Portugal every 3 years. My family was ordinary. Mom worked as a school teacher, dad in a construction firm. We had a house, an old Ford Focus, endless trips to Tesco and Asda, saving on everything. Dinner was almost always the same: potatoes, chicken, vegetables. No restaurants, no exotic dishes. Mom always repeated, "The main thing is to live within your means, don't spend more than you earn." But it drove me crazy. From my teenage years, I thought, why should I settle for less? Why can others have better, and I never can? I lived in envy of pictures. I flipped through glossy magazines with beautiful homes, watched series about women in London and New York, where they strolled through boutiques, sipped wine on terraces, traveled. I leafed through them and thought, am I any worse? When I got into university in London, everything became even clearer. Girls from my group showed up to classes in Burberry coats and Jimmy Choo shoes. On weekends, they flew to Milan or Barcelona just to wander around and update their wardrobe. They debated which hotel was better in Nice, while I sat there wondering how to stretch my paycheck from the bookstore where I worked part-time until the end of the month. My reality was a tiny room in a dorm with peeling walls and roommates who constantly threw parties. My lunch, a sandwich from the supermarket and cheap coffee. I tried not to show that I was envious, but inside, everything boiled. They were living the life I always wanted. The turning point came by chance. A friend dragged me to a party at a bar in Soho. I resisted. It seemed like I wouldn't fit in. I didn't have a proper dress or bright makeup. In the end, I put on my only black dress from a sale and went. And that's where I met him. His name was Richard. He was 39, tall, well-groomed, in a perfectly fitted suit. But what hooked me most was his demeanor. Unlike the other men in the bar who tried to outshout each other, told stories about cars, or gave cheap compliments, he was calm, confident without unnecessary words. He approached me and asked, "Are you a student?" I nodded, trying to hide my embarrassment. "Bold," he said. "London doesn't forgive poverty." That phrase hit me right in the heart, because I knew he was right. We talked for several hours. He told me about his work at an investment company, trips to New York and Zurich, his apartment in Kensington. For me, it was like a window into another world. He spoke calmly, without bragging, but I understood. Before me was a man who had everything I always wanted. When he handed me his business card at the end of the evening, I held it in my hands for a long time. It felt like a ticket to the life I dreamed of, but I was scared. Should I write or not? A couple of days later, I still sent a short message. "Thanks for the evening." That's how it all started. First date, a restaurant where one dinner cost more than my monthly stipend. He gave me a Burberry scarf. Then a weekend in Paris. Then Venice. For the first time, I stayed in hotels where the bed wasn't just made with white sheets, but with whole clouds of soft pillows and crisp fabric. For the first time, I saw menus where dishes cost as much as my monthly rent. For the first time, I felt what it means when you don't look at the price tag. I felt like Cinderella. Only Cinderella always knew the fairy tale would end. But I decided this was now my reality. A year later, he proposed. I was 23. He was almost 40. He gave me a ring with a diamond that shone so brightly I couldn't take my eyes off it, and said, "With me, you'll never have to think about money." I agreed. The wedding was like from a movie. A huge hall in a hotel, champagne, women in designer dresses, men in tuxedos. I walked down the carpeted aisle in a white dress worth several £1,000s, and everyone around looked at me with admiration. Mom cried. Friends whispered, "Emily, you hit the jackpot." And I smiled and thought, this is it, I won. Back then, I didn't know that in reality, I had just lost. I didn't marry a person. I married a picture, an illusion. And that illusion turned out to be far more dangerous than I could have imagined. At first, everything was like a dream. I lived in an apartment in Kensington, with big windows, white curtains, and a view of well-kept streets. In the morning, I woke up and went to the kitchen, where the marble island shone as if it had just been polished. The fridge always had expensive cheeses, wines, strawberries year-round. I was getting used to the new reality. Shopping on Bond Street, lunches in restaurants, weekend trips to Italy or Switzerland. Friends from my past couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the photos. I got dozens of messages. "You're living like in a movie." And I believed it myself. But very quickly, I started noticing what I hadn't seen before. First, it was loneliness. Richard was almost always busy. His phone rang constantly. He left for the office at 7 in the morning and returned late in the evening. Even at home, he wasn't with me, but with his laptop and a pile of documents. I sat in the huge apartment and caught myself thinking that I didn't know what to do. Before, I had studies, part-time jobs, friends, and now, I had a sea of time and a complete lack of freedom. Yes, I could go to a boutique, order delivery, go to a spa, but that didn't replace human interaction. I tried to suggest meeting with friends, but gradually our paths diverged. They lived ordinary student lives with exams, parties, housing payment problems. And I was the wife of a grown, wealthy man. It bothered them, and me too. Second, his control. When we first started dating, it seemed sweet that he cared about me. "You don't need to work, I'll take care of everything," he said. "You shouldn't worry about money, just enjoy." I agreed because it sounded like a dream. But soon I realized this wasn't care, this was control. If I bought something too cheap, he might notice. "Why do you need this cheap cosmetics? I can buy you better." If I wanted to meet a friend at a pub, he said, "Those places aren't for you. That's too low." He chose where we'd go, what we'd eat, even what I'd wear. And it was all presented as he knows better. At first, I thought it was his style, a habit of deciding. But then I understood it was a system. I was gradually losing myself. Third, his circle. We often went to dinners and parties where his friends gathered. Bankers, investors, company owners. Their wives, women older than me, well-groomed with expensive jewelry. I sat with them at the table and felt like a schoolgirl. They talked about home design, private schools for children, expensive resorts. I was silent. I had no children, no experience, no topics for conversation. Once, one woman, looking at my ring, said, "You're quite young with us, lucky you. Just watch, over time, all this stops being a game." Back then, I didn't understand what she meant, but her words stuck in my head. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. That loneliness was temporary. That control was care. That discomfort in his friend's company was just the age difference. But inside, anxiety was building up. One night, I woke up, looked at Richard sleeping next to me, and for the first time caught myself thinking, what if I made a mistake? That thought was frightening. I chased it away, told myself, "You wanted this yourself, you chose it. You have everything you dreamed of, don't you dare complain." But the further it went, the harder it was to stay silent with myself. And here's a moment I remember especially vividly. We were flying for the weekend to Zurich, in business class, with champagne and smiling flight attendants. I looked out the window and suddenly caught myself feeling emptiness. I thought, and yet, when I worked in the bookstore and could only afford coffee for £1, I was happier. I had goals, laughter with colleagues, plans, and now I have everything and I feel nothing. That emptiness became my shadow. From the outside, my life looked perfect. Photos from Paris, designer things, dinners in restaurants. But inside, I was starting to crack like porcelain. I didn't understand, yet, that this was only the beginning. I was still living in that beautiful picture, but the cracks were becoming more noticeable. And the scariest part, they were not only in the relationship, but in me myself. One morning, I woke up and realized that I couldn't remember the last time I laughed until tears. You know, when laughter comes from somewhere inside, from joy. I hadn't had that for a long time. My life was scheduled. Breakfast, gym, shopping, rare meetings with friends that were turning more and more into short visits. I didn't work, didn't study. There was money, but I had no purpose of my own. I felt empty. Richard lived in his own world. He had deals, meetings, calls, trips. Sometimes we dined together, but more often he sat with his phone answering emails. I tried to tell him how bored or lonely I was, but he just smiled and said, "You have everything others dream of. Just relax and enjoy." It was like a wall. Any feeling of mine bounced off and fell back on me. The hardest was his attitude toward my desires. For example, I said, "I think maybe I should go back to studying. I didn't finish my master's after all." And he replied, "Why, it's a waste of time. I can hire tutors for you if you want to learn something, but you don't need education." Or I said, "I want to get a job, even part-time." He immediately, "That's ridiculous. You don't need to work. People work who can't afford freedom." Freedom, that word sounded like mockery, because in reality, I felt anything but free. I felt it especially sharply when we went to a party at his colleagues'. There were many young people there about my age. They laughed, discussed movies, travel plans, shared work stories. I stood nearby, listened, and realized I couldn't even join the conversation. I didn't know what series were popular now because Richard considered it stupidity. I couldn't talk about work because I didn't have one. I couldn't even say, "And with my friends it was like this," because I no longer had friends. I felt like an outsider, as if I had ended up in a world I no longer belonged to. And then came another thought, scarier than the previous one. If Richard suddenly decides to leave, what will I have left? I didn't finish my studies. No job, no own money, no connections. It was like I was completely dependent on him. That thought embedded itself in my head and wouldn't let go. Everything intensified when we had our first serious argument. I wanted to go to my parents for a couple of weeks, just to relax, be at home. But Richard said, "That's pointless. Your parents live in a small town. There's nothing to do there. Better we go to Nice. I just wanted to meet a partner there." I insisted. I said, "I want to go alone." And that's when I saw the real him for the first time. He looked at me coldly and said, "You're forgetting who gave you all this. Who would you be without me?" Those words hit harder than any argument, because I understood he really thinks that my life is his achievement, that without him I'm nobody. I still went to my parents, but even there I felt like a stranger. My mom was happy that I had such a life. Friends looked at me with envy. No one understood what I felt. And I was silent. I smiled so no one would notice. But when I returned to London, I wasn't the same anymore. I started noticing details I had ignored before. His dryness, his condescending phrases, his control. I tried to talk to him, but he cut me off every time. "You chose it all yourself." And that was true. I chose it myself. But it seems I chose not life, but a cage. A cage with golden walls. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid to admit even to myself. Maybe I made a huge mistake. But that thought was getting louder. One evening in March, everything finally became unbearable. We returned from another weekend in Monaco. Palms, yachts, sun, expensive restaurants, all around seemed like festive decor. And inside me, it was empty. For the first time in several years, I felt real anxiety, almost panic fear. Richard was busy, calls, messages, planning new deals. I sat on the terrace of our apartment in Kensington, watched the rain rolling down the windows and understood, this isn't life. This is an illusion. That evening, I allowed myself to cry for the first time. Not quietly, not stealthily, but so that tears streamed down my cheeks and my heart squeezed from longing. I thought about my parents, friends, myself at 20, who dreamed of freedom and adventures, and realized I have no freedom. I have nothing real. The following weeks were the hardest. I tried to talk to Richard, at first cautiously. "I feel like I've lost myself." He looked at me condescendingly. "You're getting everything you could dream of. Why do you need anything else?" "I'm not talking about things," I said. "I'm talking about myself." He just nodded and went back to his laptop. I understood. He doesn't get it. And maybe he never will. Then I decided to act. I started searching for myself again. First, small steps. I signed up for courses, photography courses. I always loved photographing, but after the wedding, I abandoned it. I started going for walks around the city, trying to see the world through my own eyes, not Richard's. Then I tried to connect with friends, not those who envy my life, but those who were once close to me. But it turned out many paths were already closed. People's lives had diverged from mine. And then I understood one more thing. Real life can't be bought with money. The breaking point happened when I got an invitation to dinner from Richard's family. In the huge dining room with crystal chandeliers, among paintings that cost more than my apartment, I suddenly felt shame. Shame that my life was just a facade. I looked at people talking about business, luxurious trips, yachts, art collections, and understood I ended up in a world that was never mine. And that's when I thought seriously for the first time. What if I leave? That thought scared me more than anything. Leaving meant losing money, status, luxury, but staying meant losing myself. I started planning, first quietly without fuss. I wrote notes, collected documents, studied options for financial independence. I understood that the way back would be difficult, but staying in the golden cage was impossible. And then I understood the main truth I had ignored before. A beautiful life isn't enough. Real life is freedom, the ability to be yourself and make choices. That decision didn't come easily. I started meeting with a psychologist more often, talked to financial consultants, looked for paths to independence, and at the same time, built inner protection. To get out of the marriage, I needed not only strength, but a plan. I realized one more thing. Wealth and status don't save from loneliness, control, and pressure. They only mask problems that sooner or later come out. And there, standing on the terrace on a rainy London evening, I felt lightness for the first time. Not full freedom, but the possibility of choice. The possibility to tell myself, I can live differently. That was the first major crack in the illusion, but it also became the first step toward real life. Spring was almost here in London. Birds were singing, sun rays pierced through the high windows of the apartment, but inside me, darkness still reigned. Richard was busy as usual. His attention was fully absorbed by work, calls, and parties. And I sat on the couch, holding a camera in my hands and thought about my life. That day, everything changed. I accidentally met an old friend from university, Sophie. She was walking in Kensington Gardens with her husband and child. They looked happy with their own worries, their own joys. And at that moment, I realized I envied them. Not the money, not the status, but the simplicity of life itself. Sophie asked, "How are you? Everything okay?" And I couldn't lie. I said, "Honestly, I don't know." The words slipped from my lips, and for the first time in many months, I felt relief. On the way home, I understood. If I don't change something right now, my life will turn into an endless dream. Beautiful, shiny, but empty. I started planning my departure. It was all hard. Apartment, financial obligations, fear of judgment and misunderstanding from others. But the main thing, fear of the unknown. And here's the climax. Richard came home late, breathing in the scent of expensive cologne and successful life. I sat across from him, my heart pounding. "Richard," I said quietly, "I'm leaving." He didn't believe it at first. Then he froze, then tried to joke. "This is a joke, right?" "No, I want to live my own life. Free, real." I saw in his eyes a mix of surprise and irritation. He tried to convince me to stay, talked about money, luxury, status. But I had heard those words 1,000 times. I understood, this isn't life. This is an illusion. The first days after leaving were difficult. I rented a small apartment, worked, regained my sense of independence. Sometimes it seemed like I had lost too much comfort, security, shine. But gradually, I started living. I laughed, met new people, traveled again, but now not for Instagram photos, but for myself. I learned to enjoy the little things again. Morning coffee, the sound of rain outside the window, friends' laughter. I felt that life isn't what you buy with money. It's what you live through, experience, feel. A year later, I met someone new. Not rich, not high status, but just a person with whom I could talk, laugh, be myself. And for the first time in many years, I understood. Happiness isn't in luxury. Happiness is in the freedom to be yourself. Yes, I lost the ideal life with beautiful dinners, yachts, and expensive dresses. But I gained a real feeling that you can't buy for any money. And now I think about what I chose. Leaving the golden cage was the hardest, scariest, but right decision in my life. And you know, the most amazing thing, I never regretted it.